Bonjour à tous, bienvenue.
Good afternoon, welcome. I'm Dominique, economic journalist, and welcome to this opening session, which is the kickoff of the 3 days of discussion of agreement, disagreement in a rather disturbed period of time. And I would like to pay a tribute to Jean-Hervé Lorenzi and his teams who made it possible to organize this amazing event, which is now, as you know, an absolute rendezvous. So sorry about the few minutes of delay. We had a technical snag. We are connecting with Madrid, Cairo, Paris, and in Radio France Paris. So we have the first guest of a very high level, a Spanish minister, Egyptian Nobel Prize winner, the director of an international organization, and a former Minister of Culture and a great economist. Now, as the course of our story changed, so what is the impact of the COVID-19 and the operation of our countries wherever we are? Will there be a world of after, or is it some kind of a journalistic fantasy? So what are the lessons to be drawn? We are very fortunate to have with us Nadia CALVIÑO, who is the vice president, whom we'll see on screen, Vice President of the Spanish government. Madam Minister, good afternoon, Minister of Economy and Digital Transformation. Nadia CALVIñO, you are also the Spanish candidate to the presidency of the Eurogroup, and you were a budget director for the European Commission. Mr. Mohamed ELBARADEI need no introduction, Nobel Prize Peace Nobel Prize winner for your fight against nuclear proliferation. You are Egyptian, and you resigned from the government to protest the police police repression in 2013. Mrs. Louise MUSHIKIWABO, President of the International Organization of Francophonie, you were Minister of the Rwanda government in the Foreign Affairs and Information as well. You studied in the US in the 90s, which is certainly an opportunity. Françoise NYSSEN with us in the studio here in Paris, publisher of a well-known publishing house, former Minister of Culture between 2017 and 2018. On your website, you said that the next book that will be published is called the Great Vertigo. So you'll have 6 to 7 minutes to talk. Then we'll take questions from the audience, and we do already have a large number of questions. With no further ado, I will give floor to an economist, Yann, ALGAN, who is the Dean of the School of Public Affairs, Sciences Po in Paris. You have the floor. So thank you to the inaugural session of NYSSEN to deal with the course of history and as it changed. So first, it's a great pleasure for us to be in this rather modified digital version of NYSSEN, which is a bit of a change in our configuration, not so much in the course of history as such, but in our little history. There's a change going on through history, though, and the words of Proust says so. Proust said, disasters always come back, yet it is always a surprise. Marcel Proust expressed tension between the tension that existed in the duration of events, and he said that he always insisted on what was different in all the events, and the difference between what's immediate and the experience, the things that make little things that make things different. Now, often we insisted on the similarity between the terminology of war and the peril has been established. I think two differences, in my opinion. First, for the first time in the time of history, all human beings got a fright at the same time all over the world. showing that the unforeseeable was possible globally. Second difference, especially when it comes to war, or compared to war, where human beings were on battlefields, well, we had a unique experience, the confinement, which changed entirely not just our economy, our society, but our contribution, our aspect to freedom, liberty, and our relationship with intimacy. So 5 hypotheses as to the changes for this sanitary crisis.
So the first is the thesis of a big mutation with our relationship with globalization. Is COVID-19 signing the end of the global capitalism, which has been underway over the past decade? Of course, following the abrupt interruption of the world, people's relationship to globalization has been changed. In the latest survey we led, we've seen that throughout the world there's a rise in percentages for all categories in favor of a progressive closing down of the borders. The second is that of the digital capitalism. We will no doubt, in retrospective, be able to say that in the 20th century, at least in its economic dimension, began in 2020. Embryonic so far, the digital revolution is coming to light. Working remotely, as a remote school, happy hour on Zoom, Facebook meetings, and the GAFAs were no doubt the winners of this crisis. However, are we heading for an entirely digitalized territory, a world where everyone will live in their private remote circle, or has this crisis revealed our deep-rooted anthropological need to have human relationships and physical contact? The third change throughout our history is maybe that of ecology. For years, no strong action seemed possible with regard to climate change. And with the COVID-19, we've become aware that political regimes, of course, faced with a health threat, could suspend their work, and pollution. Will ecology become the mainstay of the 20th century? In the same way as territorial stakes. Finally, the fourth upturn, which is that of our relationship with politics. This has not been just a health crisis in many countries, but also a social and political crisis that puts in the forefront the main fractures in this country of strengths in other countries. And our democracy have shown also their resilience in many countries with regard to this type of crisis. Final hypothesis, and this is the final fork in the road, is that the course of history might have changed among those who write history, mankind. Indeed, the lockdown, contrary to war or former pandemics, has raised questions with regard to our relationship with our families, our private circle, our privacy to others, society, our relationship with culture, everything that is the essential and brings meaning to our lives. So these are the few hypotheses on the major changes of the course of history. Thank you, Yann. Of course, this shows a certain number of turning points with regard to economy and in particular our private life. And maybe it all boils down to saying we've all lived through a very extraordinary experience. I will pass the floor immediately to Nadia CALVIñO, the minister. Spain has been hardly hit by the disease. The economy has been hard hit by the recession that is affecting European countries as a whole. What will change, do you believe, at the outcome of this crisis? Hello. First of all, I would like to thank you for having invited me to participate in this extraordinary event. It's really a shame that we cannot all be together in Aix-en-Provence, of course. But I do believe that it was very important to hold these very important debates in the current circumstances. The questions you're asking are the right ones, and I think that the introduction was very useful in order to really focus our minds and identify a few points that I would like to underline. Beginning with the reflection on the crisis, we talk about crisis all the time, and in Greek, crisis means decision. So I think that whilst we're responding to the crisis and facing up to challenges on a daily basis, We must already begin to draw lessons, learn lessons, and take the right decisions in order to get out of this crisis as early and as best possible. And from that point of view, there is an initial reflection that I would like to share with you. It is that of the importance of the state within our economies. And all of a sudden, the citizens across the world have realized that their public health systems are absolutely key, and that the state is there to protect us. There's security, the supply of food, of beverages, and we seem to have rediscovered what is truly essential. I've just come from an extraordinary event held this morning with members of the government who signed with the social partners, the representatives of companies and unions, for the economic relaunch in Spain. And I think that the fact of signing this together, and that we were all together and have together identified the need to work together, shows the role that the public sector must adopt in the future. Second reflection, and that's along the same lines as what we already mentioned. This crisis is speeding up certain processes that were already underway, amongst which digitalization and the fight against climate change, which are essential. And the objective of fair and sustainable growth, I think, will become even more important following this crisis, because citizens wish to have a safer environment, and also because we realize that although it's difficult to face up to this crisis, we need to prepare ourselves to face up to the tremendous climate change that is before us and find the right responses. Third reflection. There are two concepts that are very relevant, which are related to what I've just said. That is intergenerational justice and resilience. We must we have high volumes of international debt. There's a record global debt this year. This will be a burden for future generations if we don't properly invest this money. And this is why we must do our very best to leave a better world to our children in order to absorb this debt in a more sustainable growth in the future. The fourth reflection, the challenges of this crisis are global and the response must be global. We realize that we need to work together in order to find a vaccine that can protect us in the future, in order to find an effective health response, but also from an economic standpoint and a social standpoint. And therefore, I believe that it is within the institutions and within a multilateral context that we must work, even more so in the coming months and coming years, if we wish to enhance our global resilience. And finally, to come back to Europe, in the internal crisis and financial crisis, many people have said that we've acted too late and too little. This time we acted fast and effectively, and I think that the Central European Bank, all of the ministers of finance and our leaders have agreed together to find a European response. In the coming weeks, there will be a negotiation for the financial framework for the coming years, and a plan of recuperation and resilience, and how to finance the European debt. And I think that this time we've clearly learnt the lesson of the crisis, and we are reacting in an appropriate manner to this global crisis. I would like to end by coming back to what I talked to you about, this signature there was this morning between the president of the Spanish government, President Sanchez, and the unions, the social partners. I was thinking about how we all need together, all of the political parties together, society as a whole, companies, workers. We must all go in the same direction in order to face the challenges that are ahead of us. Some of them we have inherited from the past, some were created by the crisis, and other are future challenges that have gathered speed due to COVID-19. And as ALGAN said clearly, across the world, we're all experiencing a global upturn at the same time. And I think that we must all pull together and concentrate on what brings us together in order to get out of this crisis. Allow me to finish on this positive idea. And I'm very interested to hear what the other participants have to say. And I'd like to wish you a very good opening of these days and an excellent session with these very important conferences. Thank you very much. I'm just going to ask you a question before I pass the floor to the next speaker. In 2009, we saw after the financial crisis of 2008-2009 that Europe took a great deal of time, a lot longer than the United States at least, to get to climb back up the hill. Do you have the impression that everything is being set up, and there will be meetings in the coming weeks on the budget, but do you have the impression that everything is being readied so that Europe this time pulls out of the crisis much faster, or will you once again be presenting to European citizens a long and hazardous road full of suffering and pain? Do you think that things might work better this time? Well, I do hope that it will not be a long, hard and painful road, as you say, but it is quite obvious that we have ahead of us some difficult times to come, because the health crisis has already turned into an economic and social crisis. But this time, I think that we're on the right route for two reasons. First of all, because immediately within the space of 3 or 4 weeks, we were able to set up a triple security line for companies, for workers, for states. With the new finances that will be financed with the debt by the European Commission, the European Investment Bank, European Stability Investments, and we very quickly set up a financial tool for state action. Parallel to the very effective and ambitious action of the European Central Bank, which is essential to maintain the financial stability, of course. That is the first element. The second element is that the European Commission has put an ambitious proposal on the table, the creation of a reconstruction and resilience fund of 750 billion, which would bring a very strong response to the challenges that face us. And in the coming days, there will be a negotiation. Of course, this depends on the possibility of finding an agreement between the different leaders of our countries. But I believe that here we at least have a strong basis on which we will be able to negotiate. So I'm rather optimistic. Thank you very much. I'm going to pass the floor to Radai. When we talked with your teams, I have the impression that you were very angry. You're quite critical, I believe, as to what we're experiencing currently, in particular, a certain number of inequalities that have been revealed in this period. Tell me if I'm mistaken, but the floor is yours.
Strong basis on which we'll be able to negotiate. Thank you very much.
Hello?
I'm going to pass the floor to Radai.
I lost them.
When we talked with your teams, I had the impression that you were
La connexion serait perdue, nous dit-on. I lost the connection. I don't know. The sound. Alors, je propose que nous allons laisser quelques instants pour que...
We will check it with the technical team. So, with no further ado, I'll give the floor, and I would like to thank her, to Louise MUSHIKIWABO from the International Francophonie organization. Well, Madame, you do have a sort of a multilateral vision or opinion, so just as the Spanish minister, or Nadia CALVIÑO, do you have a feeling that states worked together to handle this sanitary and economic crisis? Whereas other people think that some of the countries went for a go-it-alone session. Thank Thank you very much. I'm very happy to attend these meetings, the rencontre, for the first time. This is clearly a discussion that is much needed, and this is the right period because we are in several parts of the world. We are sort of pulling out of the crisis, but it is clear that in other parts of the world, the crisis is going full blast. So it is an interesting discussion. Well, I'm heading an organization that comprises 80 states and governments all over the world. Before this, I was Minister of Foreign Affairs in Rwanda for 10 years. But I'm an African woman, and it is through these three facets or prisms that I will express my comments. I believe that the crisis increased trends that already existed, and therefore the trends associated with globalization, for example, which for several years now has been blamed for destroying industry, for causing the poverty of middle classes, globalization that would have snatched or taken money away from people, and people who are now deprived of their comfort zone, of their habits, or their ways of life. But at the same time, and I'm in line now with the Spanish minister, on my experience, based on my experience, together with this organization I'm running now, but I also belong to a group of Africans who, since the beginning of the crisis, have been working on the sort of the lightening of the African debt and on the supply of sanitary and health equipment facilities. Well, there's been a collaboration trend in the crisis. Of course, movement at the beginning of the crisis, I'm talking about countries and global leaders. Well, it came so fast, it was such a shock. So, everybody ran to save their own house, shut the borders, and initially the reactions changed because this outreach to the other, this movement for solidarity and collaboration came up rapidly, and it continues, be it at the level of Europe, be it at where some countries suffered more than other countries. If we look at the African continent, for example, all African leaders followed closely what was going on in Europe. They monitored very closely the instructions, the barrier procedures, the discourse to help the population, guide the population, and we also saw the difference between, or the separation between the States and China. And all those elements did exist before, but they've been increased. But we drew many lessons from the crisis. I do believe that at the end of this crisis, we don't know when, but at the end of this crisis, we will have learned a lot about the international multilateral world of today, and we will have understood the need to work together more than we do. Small countries, large countries. I think we realized with the crisis that we all vulnerable, that we could all help one another. We see the efforts being made in all parts of the world today, in all regions of the world, or looking for a vaccine, for example. Those are efforts which show that there is collaboration. And I do believe, in my opinion, this will come forward, will be more obvious. Now, early on, we talked about the transformation and the digital impact. Well, in Francophonie country, member state of Francophonie, there is a major problem. A large part of the world is still unconnected. And for example, during the crisis, it was very difficult when you think about maintaining education in remote areas. Large part of the young population could not continue their classes at the personal level. We all, well, we were able to talk regularly we could share screens, and we had digital tools. We could talk to our families, friends. Even in fact, actually, it was a time of a closer relationship through technology. So from when it comes to the importance of the digital world, we are heading towards a period where we'll rely on the digital resources, bearing in mind that being deprived of human contact, had an impact on all of us. I'm here in Paris. I'm in Europe. I have my family in Africa. I have part of my family in the US. And honestly, we realized that, in fact, some instruments are indispensable, if only to be in touch with our other human beings. As to the environment, well, this economic and sanitary crisis, well, did show the significance of the ecology. We saw that recently with the municipal elections in France. But for a lot of people, and I do believe for many, many leaders of countries or organizations or institutions, we thought about we thought about what would be the impact of a similar ecological crisis. Now, what could happen if we don't pay more attention, if we were not to pay more attention to the ecological issues? Now, let's talk about inequalities, if you allow me. During the crisis, inequalities which already exist, I mean, there's been several forms of protest throughout the world. This is a question that concerns all countries. We realize that some inequalities, especially when it comes to healthcare infrastructure, the supply of healthcare equipment or products, well, for many countries, in Africa, for example, well, the fact that because of the confinement and being limited in movement and circulation was experienced and is still experienced as a trauma, because there are many people in the world and in Africa even who are alive because they were able to go out and get a job and earn a bit of money on a daily basis. And I think we came to realize the significance of our ways of life and how, how this is fragile, how fragile this is. So we've had a lot of discussions. I think it is a bit too early to really assess the impact of this crisis. But the only thing I'm convinced about, we'll see afterwards, but is that we felt that human beings need human beings. Human beings need nature. I grew up in forest and gardens, and I was very unhappy being locked down. But to me, it's an awakening. It's an awakening call. So we don't know what it's going to be like at the end of it, but we're now aware of human exchange, the importance of nature, of the importance, the increasing importance of the digital technology. But time will tell. Only time will tell, and only time will tell us what will have been the impact of this crisis on all of us. Thank you very much. Thank you. Learned from your talk this notion of distance, digital distance, physical distance, with split families and also economic and social links, remote link, and inequalities as well, which increase. Now, do we have Mr. ELBARADEI? Mr. ELBARADEI, do you hear us? Yes?
Alors, je suis navré, je crois qu'on ne vous entend pas à nouveau. Nous sommes confus de cela, donc je redemande, vous pouvez m'excuser, mais je vais demander à Françoise NYSSEN d'intervenir maintenant, donc ancienne ministre de la Culture. Évidemment, la place de la culture.
So, culture, the place of culture was very important during the lockdown, but culture, the cultural sector is suffering very much at the moment. So, the risk is that a certain number of people consider wrongly, of course, that the economics in the sense of industry and services is more important than that of culture in coming times. So first of all, a quick word for Mohamed ELBARADEI. I'm sorry to speak before you. I'm the editor of Al-Aswani, who you know very well. Another Egyptian person who talks about the world in her books, and through the book shows the importance of culture in order to raise awareness. The other thing I wish to say to you is that you talked about the Great Vertigo. This is not a book that I'm writing myself and publishing, but it is a wonderful book that we're publishing in September by a young author called Pierre de Couzet, and who is written about the topics that we're talking about today, and who in his writings draws a certain number of portraits about people who are involved in the topics that we're talking about today. So I do strongly recommend that you read the book. I was carefully watching all of the people who you've invited here, and it's very this Cercle des économistes is very impressive, and I feel invested with a great responsibility because I think that I'm practically the only person who represents culture here who will be talking over the coming 3 days. Whereas it seems to me that culture more than ever is essential for all sorts of reasons, but also because it is at the origin of a large part of our economy, and it's one of the activities that really contributes to the wealth, to take the metaphor of Michel Serres. I'm not going to talk about his story of the exchange, economic exchange versus cultural exchange, but culture and this sharing enriches all of us, sometimes without requiring any exchange of monetary exchange, and therefore is irreplaceable. We've understood this in all of our countries, and I wanted to raise that question. We talked about the meaning of the word crisis in Greek. In Chinese, it means both danger and opportunity. So there's a big crisis and awareness of phenomena that has been with us for many years. We are talking here, we're raising the question here as to whether the course of history has changed, but it's been changing for years. Since we entered the era of Anthropocenes, we have impacted our planet in such a way that our societal and climate change will affect us sustainably, and even more so than the period we've just lived, which is just one of the aspects, because it is due partially to the loss of biodiversity and the fact that the habitats of viruses are more directly in contact with human beings, and therefore the propagation, of course, we talk about COVID-19. That means there were 19 before, and there will no doubt be more afterwards. Therefore, it is urgent to raise these questions, generally speaking. So what appeared through all of this is that now more than ever, and you said that I'm an editor, I'm a former Minister of Culture, but I'm above all a committed citizen. I've worked in the neighborhoods with different people, and above all, to begin with, I was a biologist, and through biology, we learn about the need for knowledge and science, and we know today that everything works in cooperation. If we look at how living organisms operate, it comes down to this. And in terms of literature, if you read Marc-André Sellos, who's an eminent researcher in biology, and all of the big scientists who say, backed with evidence, that today we know that we can only move ahead thanks to cooperation, that everything is symbiosis, that everything feeds everything else, and it cannot be linear progression, but all sorts of to's and fro's, which means that if we're not careful, it will not be a trajectory, but a curve of retroaction, which instead of being positive will be negative. one of the major recent discoveries after the principle of the determination of Zonberg or Gödel's and the theory of relativity of Einstein, these theoreticians and mathematicians who showed us the relativity and how doubt can nourish us. And through the epidemic, we can see that nothing is determined as we imagine it. And we must take into account all of these questions. And all of these questions can be carried because they lead us to think no longer in terms of extraction, of vertical extraction or as a silo, but I think that we will not be saved, and this is why we're so happy to hear the words of Louise Michel-Huargo, who was talking about the necessary link and the wealth that this can bring to us. And the health crisis has revealed how important all of this is. And you have all noted that it is through cultural expressions that we have survived as a society, and that art is a part of this society. And of course, the proposal that has been made is that artists should be able to come and enrich schools. This is what I tried to work on when I was a minister. This cultural awareness is very important in our lives, and we must work on this very intensely. And the proof is, I would say to a certain extent, to promote the notion of cultural rights and the importance of these relationships, and the idea of the new democratic culture, which is very important. What we're trying to do in ALGAN through an entire ecosystem that's set off from a publishing house and authors, a place where we have culture, music, art, and to turn this into a school. And our site is organized around agroecology because this is a very important aspect which affects our health, and therefore we have to use agriculture but be respectful of soil, nature, everything that Hippocrates said, who said food is our health. So we cannot take one problem without broaching the entire ecosystem as a whole. And this is what we're trying to do in the field, and this was why I was very happy to bear testimony here as a player in the field to say it is possible and we can be a source of economy, to the extent that in the city of Al, where I live, it is culture that is really at the basis of the city's economy. And at the end of August, we will be working on all of these things because we're working on a major forum called Act for Life. And there is a way of apprehending the world and policies, because you also talked about the question of representation. Let us be very concentrated and attentive to what is happening with the Citizens' Agreement for the Climate, which is happening in France, because there's something going on here where we asked citizens to put in hours of work and listening to the experts, learning about the knowledge that we have, and then to issue proposals. They've made their proposals. We hope that these will be translated into facts, because our future depends on it, the future of our children. Let us be sure of what we are to expect, and let's act at the grassroots level in order to implement change. Thank you, Françoise Nissen. A final attempt with Madame Abai.
Pouvons-nous vous entendre?
Can you hear us, sir?
Hello? Well, it's a pleasure for me to be part of this important panel.
Bon, j'ai l'impression que ça ne fonctionne pas et je suis confus et je n'ai pas d'indication dans mon casque me disant.
Can you hear me? I don't know what is happening.
Ça fonctionne.
Hello?
Allez-y alors, monsieur Baradei.
Allez-y, monsieur Baradei, allez-y. Nous vous entendons.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, sir. We can hear you. Keep talking. Speak. Thank you.
Please. Thank you.
It's a pleasure for me to be part of this important panel at a time when the whole world is thrown into a soul-searching mode. But let me start that I'm very happy to be the only male in this panel, so at least we are doing something right at this stage. I would like to speak about three issues. One is the inequality that is hitting us in the face as a result of COVID-19. And it is not true that the virus does not discriminate. The virus does discriminate very well. If we see the disproportionate number of people, poor people, disadvantaged people who are infected or dying. Why is that? Because they don't have access to the healthcare system. They can't afford social distancing because the dwelling where they live is too close to have any distance, and they have to go back to work. I mean, what we call them essential workers. In a country like Egypt, for example, it's a 40% of the people who live in informal economy, which means they have to go down to work. So for them, it's a balance between protecting life or protecting livelihood. This is the number one issue. The second issue I'd like to mention is the complete distorted priorities we have. At the time last year when we spent $1.8 trillion on armament, we had to go into what we call triage, when we have to choose who's going to live and who is going to die, frankly. It's Hobson's choice, Sophie's choice. Don't we have the resources to do better? But that's the reality. What we saw, we spent less than 10% of what we spent on armament on official development assistance. You know, as a result, we still have 2 billion people who live in poverty. So these are issues that they are not new. Thomas Piketty and many others talked about poverty, inequality, but we haven't really done much about it until now, when we see it in a very gruesome, very obscene way. The third issue, again, I'd like to talk about is international cooperation. At a time when we need international cooperation the most, at a time when none of our problems could be resolved without international cooperation, whether the pandemics, whether terrorism, whether climate change, you name it, we need international cooperation. But where is the international cooperation today? I'll give you 2 examples. Security Council, who is supposed to be the primary body for international peace and security, is not able, after 3 months of the pandemic, to agree on a plan of action. Until today, they are not able to live up to their responsibility and provide a plan of action. Secondly is WHO. This is an organization which we have since 1948 to combat disease, make sure that we combat pandemics. And what we see with WHO, it's an organization that bereft in resources, bereft in authority. They have to coax and woo member states to get information, rather than like the organization I used to work with, the International Atomic Energy Agency, when you have the mandate to go and seek the facts and establish the fact and share the fact. But what is worse even with WHO is that at the middle of the pandemic, the American pulled out of it. It's just like cutting your nose to spite your face. Who is losing? Everybody is losing. So these are 3 issues I'd like at least to mention that coming out, to my mind, coming out very clearly. They are not new, but they are accentuated by the COVID-19. And the question is, are we, as you mentioned, are we going to say business as usual, or are we going to change and calibrate our values? I think Françoise talked about culture. You know, culture is key, because culture to me is a lot of values. You know, I see I'm not sure I'm optimistic or pessimistic. It's still, the jury is out, as they say. On the one hand, I don't see much leadership or vision around the world. I mean, leaders are fighting like cats and dogs with each other until today. But on the other hand, I see a heightened awareness of some of the ills we are facing. If you look at the fight against institutional racism, for example, well, that is something good. But have we done it all the way? Are we do we have the same heightened awareness vis-a-vis the refugees that are dying in the sea? We have seen, but there are some glimmer of hope. If I look now, Spain, for example, where Nadia is coming from, they have now universal basic income. Italy, I think, have established the same. So there is this heightened awareness that we need to be compassionate, as I call it. The sense of compassion, sense of closeness, sense of working together, it is coming. How far we will be able to go on that, whether we are going to make full benefit, take the opportunity of the pandemic, or simply forget about it once we have a cure for the disease, remains to be seen to me. So the ball is still the jury is still out, and we'll have to see.
Merci.
Thank you very much for your words. We're going to take two questions, one which will be read, raised by Fifi from Toulouse. And the question is for Mohamed ELBARADEI and Louise MUSHIKIWABO, and another question from London from Yann for Nadia CALVIñO. Yes, this is a question from Toulouse for the General Secretary of French-speaking countries and Mr. ELBARADEI, Nobel Prize of Peace. We have two eminent representatives of Africa with us. And we would like to know what your view of the situation of Africa is at the outcome of this crisis. How will Africa come out of this crisis? Are you optimistic or pessimistic? Ms. Secretary General first. Yes, thank you. Above all, on the health aspect. On the from the health aspect, I don't know. From the health aspect, so far, without going into elaborate scientific explanations, Africa has been preserved somewhat as compared to the rest of the world, and to certain countries, above all in Europe and in America, be it the United States or Latin America. But there have been trends in the past few weeks with a rising number of cases. Having said this, I believe that Africa will come out of this crisis with a major finding, and that is that Africa, generally speaking, Africa has not sufficiently invested in health, be it in terms of infrastructure or procedures. I predict that at the outcome of this crisis, many African countries will review their budgets related to health systems, and they will have larger budgets. With regard to the non-health aspects, economically, Africa has been hit hard. That is the main concern today for many African people. On the continent, out of 54 countries, there are 4 or 5 countries who have been really hard hit. But all countries, the whole of Africa, the entire continent, is suffering, was already suffering right from the beginning of the crisis, from the economic impact. Many countries, North Africa and East Africa, in my own country, Rwanda, and in Kenya, there are countries that, for whom tourism is very important, a source of income, and there are a lot of services around this. And these countries will be really hard hit. But for the rest of the continent also, the expense of managing this crisis, what I'm sure of is that from an economic viewpoint, Africa will suffer tremendously. But on the positive note, I was very positively surprised by the way in which the crisis was managed right from the beginning, with rather restrictive measures for a continent with a lifestyle and economy that it has. And so therefore we will see at the end of the crisis, but Africa for sure will be very hard hit economically. Mohamed ELBARADEI.
Comment voyez-vous la situation pour le continent?
In Africa, how do you see the situation for the African continent on the health and economy plan? Please be brief, sir. Thank you very much.
Okay, brief, we need an act of God. The situation is very precarious. I had yesterday a meeting on Africa, on the healthcare in Africa. What we have today is 10% of the critical care beds that will be needed. The expectation that the virus will bloom in July and August, September. So we haven't seen the end of it. In fact, it is the curve is still going up. In the economy, again, as we have seen, the countries do not have the resources to provide economic stimulus. The countries do not have the resources to provide social security. So people are forced to go back to work and get exposed to the virus. So the situation is not pretty, but again, it shows the impact in an obscene way of inequality within countries and between countries. So I can't really say I'm optimistic. I had 2 hours meeting yesterday on what's happening in South Africa, and I can tell you, let us just pray.
Merci.
Thank you. A question raised from London by Nadia CALVIñO. If you were president, and of course this question comes from London, I don't think it's by chance. If you're at the head of Eurogroup, what would you say to the European savers? Will the COVID crisis debt one day be refunded, or would it be wiped out? And if it is wiped out or refunded, when will that be? That's rather a tricky question. Yeah, it's a question that's very easy to answer, of course, because of course the debt will be refunded. I have no doubt. We're currently looking at an investment process that will allow Europe to recover the growth as fast as possible. The same growth dynamics that we were engaged in until we were hit by the crisis. So the debt is guaranteed in the long term, and we're setting up plans and acting responsibly as Europe always has. So I think that we acted in time, and I would just like to say that I hope that Mr. ELBARADEI is not right, that all that's left is not just prayer, but that if we work together, act together, and we can find the right responses and set up the right action plans in order to pull out of this crisis as early and as best possible. But I would just like to come to the question raised by Mrs. MUSHIKIWABO, which is related to the same question. I read that this time we acted very fast in order to try and alleviate the financial strife of the different countries. All of the multilateral organizations, the World Bank, the Regional Development Bank. Next week we will have an event coordinated by Paris, the Paris Club, to talk about the global debt. I think that we very quickly realized this time that it was not sufficient just to bring a health response, but that we had to be particularly careful to help the countries that are struggling the most in the world. And there is a solidarity amongst us that I believe that we can build on in the future on a multilateral basis. Thank you very much to all 4 of you. It is time to bring this first session to a close. And I would like to also thank the translation teams in Marseille and the technical team in Paris in the Maison La Radio. Thank you once again to the speakers and enjoy the rest of these